and the legends around it. Yep, got it. We're good with that. Awesome. I think in many ways, the stories and the legends that come out of the cities are sometimes more meaningful and maybe meaning making than even the actual archaeological history. We look at both, but maybe I'm a bit of an existentialist there, where I think that, you know, whether or not these legends were true, they were meaningful to the people and they helped them to understand them. So we're going to talk about some of those legends that come from the city of Sardis. Today it is called Sart in Turkey. So you can see how the name has carried on just in a slightly variated format. So the city of Sart today, the ancient city of Sardis. Okay. And as always, we like maps. So we want to see where that city of Sardis is. And if you look at the map, you can see that it is right in the heart of the 7 cities. Pretty cool. It's connected in the north, to the north. Pergamum, Thyatira, we just visited those two the last 2 weeks. If you were to travel in this direction to the west, you would find Smyrna, and then just a little bit south, Ephesus. And then, of course, if you were to travel south in this direction, you would get to Philadelphia and Laodicea. So it really is the center, towards the center, being the 5th letter that we get in this study that we're doing and in the book of Revelation. Now, the stories about the founding of Sardis come to us from Herodotus, and I put a little image of him over here. So he is a Greek historian and the father of history. So we get lots of different stories about how cities were formed. And you know that, like I said before, there's almost always some legend or myth. And so according to this one, the city was founded by the sons of Hercules himself. And I put the picture over here, you know, Hercules. And they were called the Heraclides or the Heraclides. So it depends on how you pronounce it. And by the way, I don't always pronounce these things wrong. You can even go to Google Translate and listen to how it sounds in modern Greek and then how the transliteration is in English. And I'm like, well, they broke that syllable up completely different there. So I may not be quite right in the way I pronounce things, but that's what you get for just learning from a book sometimes and not learning from a living person. And so much of our learning is virtual these days, isn't it? So founded by the Heraclides, we're going to go with that. And it was ruled by them for over 500 years. So it was a dynasty that lasted for quite some time, these sons of Hercules who started this majestic city. And the story of how it ended, I think, is quite something. So you may have heard of it before. Maybe Susanna is familiar with some of the art. I put it up here for you. So this is the legend that sounds an awful lot like a story we get in the Old Testament. And you may pick up on that. So the very last Heraclides ruler, his name was Candales, and he was so proud of his wife's beauty that he invited Hygieis, or Gigis, however you want to pronounce that one, to come and see it for himself. So in this story, you can see, well, over here, you've got Candales here with his wife, and then he's like, come over here and take a look and peek on her beauty. And so you've got Hygieis over here. And then I like the plate especially because in the plate, you can see Cupid up here shooting Gigis with the arrow so that he is so struck by the beauty of this queen that he falls in love with her. But according to the story, when the queen finds out what her husband has done and that she let somebody else look on her naked, that she goes to him, to Hygieis, you know, rather than having him killed for having seen her naked, she plots with him and says, kill my husband. So in retribution for the husband letting the wife be seen naked, she gets the rival to come and kill him. So Hygieis kills the king. That's the end of the Heraclides and the start of the Mermanides. Again, I don't know if I'm saying the Mermanid dynasty correctly, but you get the idea. So that was the start of their dynasty. And their dynasty lasted for about 200 years. And it is what we know as the ancient kingdom of Lydia. And so you remember last week, we talked about Thyatira being part of Lydia. I don't know if you remember that or not, but anyway, we did. And so this week, we're going to talk even more about the kingdom of Lydia, and we're going to talk about a few things that are important during those 200 years. Probably the most famous thing that came from out of those 200 years was this guy. How many of you have ever heard of the saying, rich as Croesus? You ever heard that saying before? Okay, this is where it comes from. It's from this guy, the very last king of this dynasty. So he's the one that it all ended with. But before it all ended, it's true. This guy was super rich, and you can hopefully remember it if you remember this image. So the Lydians, supposedly, are the people who invented coins. Now, there's a lot of debate among numismatics, and that's the study of ancient, well, coins in general, but among ancient numismatics, they will debate who actually invented coins. But many people say that, at least in the West, it was invented by the Lydians. And this is an image of a gold coin of King Croesus himself that we can see in museums today, coming from around 550 BCE. And so it looks like it's a gold coin, but technically it took a while to get it to be pure gold, because they had a mountain. And on this mountain, this river flowed down, and at the bottom, it would have just silting of this aluminum that was called electrum, if you've ever heard of that. An electrum was a mixture of both silver and gold. And so they'd have to go through this whole process of purifying it to get it to be pure gold. But anyway, this was the point in history where the merchants before, you would pay by the weight of, a gold bar or a silver bar. And basically, you were hoping that they were weighing it correctly and not cheating the scales, and you don't know how pure it is. And so this is the point in history where the king, the government, takes responsibility and ensures the validity of the weight of these coins. That's why the image of the king is often stamped on a coin, because it's saying, I approve this coin, right? Because before that, it's a bit of buyer beware. You hope that that merchant is giving you a square deal with that coin. So this is where kings take charge. They start minting different coins and putting different images on them. And Croesus was so wealthy because of all of this electrum that came down from the river. It's the Pactolus River, if you really want to know what the river is called, that he was able to do a lot of cool things. Oh, and one other fun little connection with mythology is that this Pactolus River, the legend was, it was so full of this gold, really electrum, because King Midas had washed his hands there, and he had the golden touch, and so it washed off into this river, and so that's where their wealth came from. So another important legend of history is connected here. So he's so rich that he gets to do things like being a benefactor. We've talked about patrons in the ancient world. Well, he was a patron of many temples, so he was a guy who was pretty religious, and in fact, he built the Temple of Artemis. We've talked about it before in Ephesus. That was one of the 7 wonders of the world. Not this one in this image. This is the one that we all think of from the time of Paul. So this is the temple that would have been there during the time of Revelation as well. Here's the Statue of Artemis, since we've already visited Ephesus. Not this one, but the one prior to it. And you may have remembered me telling you the story that there was that crazy guy that went and burned down the temple because he wanted to be remembered for something, and we still do remember him after all these years of burning down the temple. And legend said that it got burned down because Artemis was so busy helping with the birth of Alexander the Great that day that she couldn't pay attention to her temple, right? So the one that got burned down was the one that Croesus had helped build. So he was a big patron to the goddess Artemis. He was also a big patron to this temple over in Delphi, which you may have, that's probably even more famous to you than any other temple, because if you've ever heard of the Delphi oracles that are over in what is today Delphi, Greece, at the Temple of Apollo, then you may be more famous or familiar with the story of how Apollo slays this big snake, the python. And well, to fast forward, because it's not all that important to our story right now, Apollo, being a god of prophecy, also through the spirit of Pythia, connected with this python, would always have these fortune-telling priestesses that were there. And so people from all over the ancient world would send to this temple and to ask the Pythia, this main priestess, what's going to happen in my future, or what should I do in X, Y, Z of my life. And so Croesus had donated a lot to both of these temples. And so he sends there for a few different questions. But the one that's going to become really important is he asked, what should I do about this guy over here next to me? Because if you look at the map again, you can see that this is Lydia over here. And right next door, you see that green? Yeah. Media, the Persians, at that point, they were ruled by this guy, Cyrus the Great. You may remember his name from Old Testament. So king of Persia, king of Media. And he wasn't quite sure what to do about him. Should I just leave him alone? Should I maybe go and attack him? And so he sends over to the Delphi Oracle and asks the Pythia, what should I do? Should I attack or not attack? And the message that he gets back is, if Croesus goes to war, a mighty empire will fall. And if you remember any stories from mythology having to do with this oracle, you know that it's kind of treacherous. That's the way I feel about it, because he interprets it one way. He's like, oh, great, I'm going to cause the king of Cyrus, the mighty empire of Persia, to fall. If I go to war, I'm going to take him down. Again, not always the interpretation. It's always in the interpretation, right? So he takes it and interprets it, and here's what he wants to hear. And he goes and he attacks Cyrus. And he attacks over here in a little, well, it's not a little city, but now it is, Pteria in Cappadocia, which is a beautiful region. And just for fun, I threw a picture of Duke and I here. This was just last fall. Beautiful area of Cappadocia. He goes and he attacks it. He besieges the city. He captures this Persian city and he enslaves all the inhabitants. Well, as you might imagine, that's a little provoking to Cyrus. And so Cyrus brings his army over there, marches against the Lydians. The battle that takes place at Pteria is basically a stalemate, but it does force the Lydians to retreat back to their capital of Sardis. So they decide to retreat and to regroup over here. This is the Acropolis of Sardis. Very famous because usually when they retreat there, they're fine. Very hard to take this citadel up here. It was basically impregnable. So they do meet the Persians on a battle on open field, and they actually, Croesus had twice the numbers, but still Cyrus is prevailing. And so they all retreat back to the citadel, and there's a 14-day siege of the citadel. And Cyrus is getting frustrated. He doesn't know how in the world he is going to possibly take this Acropolis of Sardis. That's very, very difficult to take. And he offers a great reward to anybody that can figure out a plan of how we're going to take the citadel. So according to legend, some of Cyrus's soldiers, they're being depicted down here, the Persians, looking up at the Lydians up here on the Acropolis. One of them happens to notice a Lydian soldier whose helmet falls off. And his helmet falls off, and he takes this winding little road, some secret passageway out of the citadel and down this road, and he picks up his helmet because he doesn't want to get in trouble. Well, when he does that, he alerts these guys over here to how they can come in and take the city, which they do. And so they come in, they take the city, and yeah, the kingdom of Lydia is no more. That's the end of the kingdom of Lydia. It's absorbed by the Persian Empire. And you remember I told you way, way, way back when we first started this study that the Persians were the ones who made this first ancient superhighway. And this Persian royal road that goes all the way across Anatolia from the capital in Susa ends in Sardis. That's its original ending, because Sardis becomes basically the administrative center in that area of the world for the Persians. So still an important city, but not a kingdom anymore after that point. And you'll remember I also told you a while ago that, I mean, these highways are very important. The caravanserais that they built, it's basically like every 15 miles, say like 25 kilometers, they would build these caravanserais to stop along the way, and cities grew up, and also Christian communities grew up, including one that grew up in Sardis. So we know that there were Christians there, and we know that they survived for quite some time. Here's an example of a 4th century Christian church. These are the remains of it. You can see another shot of it right here. It's just an early Christian basilica, and this is our tour guide Jenks standing in the middle of the apse. And this was actually, you can see it right down here in the corner. It was built, and they did this a lot, Christians, actually all religions seem to do this. They took what was already there and they made it their own. And so they took this ancient temple to Artemis. So Ephesus had a temple to Artemis, and so did Sardis. So they took this ancient temple of Artemis and they reused it as a Christian church. So let's talk for a minute about the religion that was going on in Sardis back in that day. So We know that they worshiped a lot of the same Greek and Roman gods. I don't know. I kind of wonder, since again, they've got so many different kingdoms coming through here and taking over, that maybe that is why they're so cool with having a pantheon of deities and why they're able to amalgamate these gods together. Because, hey, we've got this ancient mother god, Cybele, Sybil, however you want to pronounce her name. You've got Artemis, cool, same, So basically, their local deities get amalgamated with some of these Greco-Roman gods. And so Cybele becomes Artemis, no problem. And you can see that they built a very spectacular temple. I mean, look how big these pillars are. We've got some former Messiah students giving you some scale by sitting on them for us. They're showing you how big and magnificent it was. And of course, I mentioned before that they often will build these temples to Artemis in lands that have rich agriculture because, of course, she's a goddess of fertility, right? So they want to keep being fertile. They want things to keep growing. So it's just set in this beautiful setting. The land over there is really lovely, still very fertile today. And here you go. Here's another shot of the temple and the Christian church that is built over here. So they're very religious. They also happen to have a Lydian version of the Greek god Zeus. So they amalgamate that one too. So no problem with the gods. They also have some emperor worship, although you remember the first 3 cities we visited all had a Neocorus title. Very proud of that. Poor Thyatira never had that. And I kind of like what Sardis did. So they had an earthquake, as did every city, and Emperor Tiberius helped them rebuild it. And so in honor of Emperor Tiberius, they built a temple in his honor that was not actually sanctioned by the Roman government. So it's kind of like this unauthorized Neocorus, which is a really bold move, to just say, we're just going to go ahead and do it. So they technically didn't get the honor of being a Neocorus, but they built a temple to the emperor anyway. We're just so anxious to honor him and praise this god, because again, they considered their rulers divine, or at least they worshiped them as that. And also religion. So we've talked about some of the ancient Greco-Roman deities. We've talked about the emperor worship that's going on there. We also know that Sardis was the home of a pretty large community of wealthy, influential Jews. And we know that from several different places. We actually hear in the Old Testament about some of, you remember the Babylonian exile when they get taken off and scattered all around Babylonia. Well, eventually some of them go to a place that is now known as Sardis. So we know that there was a wave of immigrants that go there. And we also know that they're wealthy and influential because of the scale, size, and beauty of the synagogue that's there. And this is one of the most impressive ancient synagogues that I think you can find anywhere. Here's a model, kind of the scale of it. And this kind of shows you a bit of what it's like. I've got some better pictures. Now, the synagogue originally was part of a larger Roman complex, and it was a gymnasium complex. I'm going to show you some pictures of that before, but you see this wall right here. So over here on the left side, on the right side, you can just see some of the synagogue here, these pillars here, and then past it, this really big structure sticking up. You'll see it's a bit more of what's left of the gymnasium and has been rebuilt. But focusing on the synagogue here, I mean, it's so wealthy that you can see they basically have, you see the archway in the center, and then it's got basically 2 arcs where they would probably keep copies of the Torah scrolls. They have 2, not just 1. So they would house them there, and they would go and take those scrolls out, and then they'd probably put them on this table whenever they're going to read from the Torah. And you can see that they even have an area right behind there where probably the elders of the synagogue would have been sitting. So you can see that. Also pretty cool, because I just like, we often accuse pagans of being just very syncretistic, and they are happy to bring in different gods and amalgamate them. Well, I mean, to be fair, to some extent, the Jews were happy to amalgamate some things too. And this is a really interesting example, because you can see here, this table that they probably used to read the Torah scrolls, it's spolia, which is just ancient example of, we talk about reduce, reuse, and recycle. This is ancient reuse. So they just take stuff from other temples, from other buildings. And so you can see the Roman eagle here, you can see these little lions here that they've appropriated from other buildings and just reused in their synagogue. So they apparently didn't have problems reusing some things from pagan culture, right? So they were using those things. I mean, just it's spectacular. I mean, look at the wealth of these people if they can pay for mosaics like this. And here's a zooming in of just this teeny tiny little tessera to build these mosaics. It's amazing. And look at the marble on the walls. I mean, seriously, very wealthy group of Jews around there. Interesting though, in the letter, it's not going to talk about the Jewish community. We've seen some of the other letters talking about the Jewish communities. I don't know why they're not mentioned in this letter, but clearly there were a lot of Jewish communities in this area of Asia Minor. And here is the gymnasium. And again, we've got some nice Messiah College students posing for us in front and showing the flexing and, that this was a place where they go to work out. But as I told you early on, ancient gymnasiums were not just a place to work out. It was a place to flex your muscles and your minds. So they would go there to study and to be formed mentally and physically. And here we've got a pool. So they're standing in the middle of what would have been an ancient pool. Oops, didn't mean to go by that so fast. So here's the pool. And of course, they would have had a complex of, the hot baths and the cold baths and the tepid baths. And then, of course, just the structure is amazing. And here's another little fun fact for you guys to use. So we often talk about reconstructions of ancient works. So this is one of the best reconstructions of an ancient gymnasium that you will find. But when archaeologists say reconstruction, they're talking about something that only preserves less than 50% of the original building. If it preserves more than 50%, they call it a anastosis, which sounds a lot like resurrection, doesn't it? Anastosis, but you've got that so basically they are reconstructing it, but with more than 50% of the original. When they have to reconstruct it with less, they just call it a reconstruction. And it's fun because I kind of like the way they do it, because they put a little bit here to give you an idea of the marble that it would have been coating that brick structure, but they don't completely finish it. And you can also tell, like, you see the different coloration on these columns here. It kind of shows you the difference between the original pieces that they had left and what they had to reconstruct out of other things. So it's kind of cool when you go and see it. But yeah, just absolutely beautiful. So that's probably enough about the ancient city. Let's go to the letter itself. So the letter to Sardis, you can open your Bibles if you would like to Revelation chapter 3. So now we're in chapter 3. Or you can follow along in the handout package that I gave, if that helps. Or you can just look at your screen, because I'm going to put it all up there on the screen. So however you like to do it. So remember, we have divided these letters, or as some scholars are now preferring to call them, messages, sermons. I think I had showed you guys before. Real quick, I'll show it again. If you're looking for one of the newest books about the letters to the churches in Revelation, this one's called The Sermons to the Seven Churches of Revelation. Sorry, it probably looks flipped backwards for you guys, but it's by Jeffrey Wyma. So he's a friend of mine who also leads a lot of groups and students over in Turkey to visit these churches. So it's a great book, but I think he probably overstates the case, but he really wants to say, no, they're not just letters, they're sermons, messages to these churches. So whatever we want to call them, they're getting a message. Let's just say that. And as we see in messages, letters, essays, they usually have three parts: the introduction, the body, and the conclusion. And in those three parts, to simplify things, we're breaking it down into two. And so in the introduction, we always have the two parts: the church, so the recipient. And here we've got to the angel of the church in Sardis, right? And then we have the Christ title. These are the words of the one who holds God's seven spirits and the seven stars. Okay, simple. Let's tackle the latter part first, because we've already talked about the seven stars before. If you remember, in the letter to Ephesus, this same image was used in that Christ title, and that same image is coming from chapter 1, always something from chapter 1. And this is the apocalyptic vision, the opening vision of Jesus in chapter 1. And remember, we talk about Jesus being the person who holds the 7 stars in his right hand. And then we're told a little bit later, we get an interpretation of that. As for the mystery of the 7 stars that you saw in my right hand and the 7 golden lampstands, the 7 stars are the angels, same Greek word for messengers, right? Of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. And just as a review, we talked about before how ancient numismatics helps us understand these 7 stars. We know that stars, or the whole universe, were thought of as controlling destiny. So they were powerful. And the person who could hold the 7 stars in their hand was the person who controlled destiny and had the ultimate power, right? So we get coins like this one with Emperor Hadrian, clearly crescent moon, but also you can see how that image kind of looks like a cupped hand holding the 7 stars. And remember, 7 is the number for completion, so total power. So here's an even, I think, more pertinent image, because this is actually coming from the time of John and the writing of Revelation, as most scholars believe it was written during the time of Emperor Domitian. And you remember I told you the story that Emperor Domitian and his wife Domitia happened to lose one of their sons in infancy. And so because of that, they minted a coin to remember him, and they put their infant son sitting on top of the world, juggling the 7 stars in his hands, which basically says that he is now in heaven. He is a God divine in heaven, all power. And if you look at the inscriptions that are around their heads, Domitia is called the mother of the divine Caesar, so mother of a god. He is clearly father of a god, right? So there's some claim to divinity being made, but it's just interesting, that imagery of the 7 stars, the person who controls the universe. So for Jesus to be called the person who holds the 7 stars in his hands, not Caesar, that is treasonous. It is a statement of who you believe Jesus is and who you believe, I think, Caesar is not. So definitely would not be a happy image in towns that worship Caesar as God and built temples in honor of Caesar. Now, when we come to the 7 spirits, okay, technically not in the apocalyptic vision portion in chapter 1 of Jesus, but also still in chapter 1, we hear about 7 spirits, but it's in the opening greeting. So we hear, grace and peace to you from the one who is and was and is coming, right? That has to do more with the letter to Smyrna. If you remember, some of that gets referenced there. And from the 7 spirits that are before God's throne, and from Jesus Christ, the faithful witness, the firstborn from among the dead, and the ruler of the kings of the earth. Now, some people think this is an early example of a Trinitarian formula, God being the one who is and was and is coming, the Alpha and Omega, the 7 spirits, the complete full spirit, of God, and then Jesus, maybe not. But some people do point to it as a very early example of a Trinitarian formula being formulated or thought about. But certainly 7 does mean complete. And so it does point to a complete spirit. And some people think it is pointing towards the Holy Spirit. So you remember we talked about before how there is always kind of foreshadowing of what is to come in the rest of the letter in this particular part. And here I think it's interesting that he talks about the one who holds not just the 7 stars, but the 7 spirits, the complete spirit, when he's talking to a congregation that he's about to call spiritually dead. So people need to be enlivened, given life, given spirit again when they're dead. So I think that's interesting, and that's to come. So watch it. Then if we move on, well, actually, I'll pause. Do you have any questions about the introduction first? If you do, you can, unpause and ask them if you want to. Anybody? Nope. All right, good. Then we'll keep going with the body. So when we get to the body, we get the compliments and or complaint section, and then we get the consequences, warnings and or promises. Some churches get both. Some churches get one or the other. And so let's see what we get with Sardis. Well, when we get to the complaints, the compliments, sorry, not complaints, compliments, we get none, which I think is really, really harsh. Actually, Sardis and Laodicea, who we'll see in a couple more weeks, are the only two churches that have no compliment section here. So it doesn't have anything nice to say about them, although we do hear later in the promise that there are a few that have held out and not soiled their garments. But here in the compliment section, he didn't have anything nice to say to him. He jumps right into complaints. That's all they get. And here he says, I know your works. You have the reputation of being alive, and you are in fact dead. Yes, I know this image is anachronistic, but it just kind of reminds me of just a beautiful but dead corpse. That is the way one scholar describes this church. And I thought it was just a poignant sort of picture. I'll actually read it to you. So this is Alan Johnson. So I thought it was an interesting quote. He says, how does a church die? Why does Christ use this expression for Sardis, even though the churches in Thyatira and Laodicea also had very serious problems? Sardis had had significant fame as a royal city, but now, at this point of writing, it was nothing. The citizens were living off past fame. Apparently, the same spirit had infected the church. Their loyalty and service to Christ was in the past. Now they were nothing. It may be that they had so made peace with the surrounding society that the offense of the cross had ceased, and they were no longer in jeopardy of life or vulnerable to suffering. Further facts emerge when we consider the series of commands in verses 2 and 3. Death was a special preoccupation of the Sardinians, as witnessed by the impressive necropolis 7 miles from the city. What had been a part of the pagan rites had also crept into the church. But again, this work of the enemy came through deception. The Sardinian church was, for the most part, a duped church. And that's from Alan Johnson, Revelation. It's in the Expositor's Bible Commentary, if you want to look at that one. So I thought it was interesting, just a beautiful, but it's Beasley Murray in his commentary. He's the one who actually came up with the comparison of a corpse, beautiful but dead. So I thought it was interesting. And then if this analogy helps you to remember the church in Sardis, because it's a bit more modern, The Walking Dead, if you haven't watched the series, you've at least heard of it. So I think about the Sardinians as the Walking Dead. And this is what our friend John Yates had to say about them. He says, the city of Sardis had a church composed of nominal, self-satisfied Christians. There was no evidence of persecution. The difficulty was spiritual apathy, which is often present when there is no persecution. The Christians of Sardis present a contrast with those in Smyrna, where physical death was all around, but they were spiritually alive. In Sardis, Christians gave the appearance of being alive, but they were spiritually dead. So I thought that was a very interesting comparison. The church, where we don't hear anything about them suffering or being persecuted, is the one that's dead. So that is a very interesting thing, and irony. Then we hear the consequences section, the warnings. We are told, wake up and strengthen whatever you have left, teetering on the brink of death, for I found that your works are far from complete in the eyes of my God. So remember what you received and heard. Hold on to it and change your hearts and lives. If you don't wake up, I will come like a thief, and you won't know what time I will come upon you. And then I put this, just this cross inscription that is found in Sardis in one of the many shops that is on the side of the synagogue as you walk in towards the gymnasium. I think in many ways, this kind of brings to mind that impregnable citadel of Sardis. You remember that was captured by surprise by Cyrus the Great. And again, this happened a second time that by Antiochus III. So twice it was taken by surprise. So maybe they're hearkening back to this idea of the city, of people asleep who aren't paying attention, who don't realize that they're tottering on the verge of death and about to be destroyed. They're ignorant of that. And this is something that we hear of in Paul's letters, that thief in the night, that surprise visitor who comes when you're least expecting them, just like that surprise army. Well, you knew the army was outside, but you didn't know that they were going to take over this impregnable citadel. So wake up, pay attention, or else you're about to be destroyed. Similarly, the Sardinians' deeds were in danger of judgment because Christ had not found them complete. They did not, reach to the full measure in the sight of God of what was expected. I don't know if their lack of completeness is the number, just like, 7 is the number of completeness. Probably not being quite that literal. Maybe it's more the quality of their deeds, but something about their works was found wanting and not measuring up to what Christ expected. Very different from some of the other letters in the other churches where they are commended for their love, their faithfulness, perseverance. So usually the other churches were known for doing something, or at least a remnant was known for that. Here, all the remnant is known for is not having sold their garments. And we get this in the promise. We're told, but you do have a few people in Sardis who haven't stained their clothing. That's it. Not that they're holding, well, I guess technically that would be holding fast, but not that they are really well known for their works, their faithfulness, their endurance, their love, just that they haven't stained their clothing. They will walk with me clothed in white because they're worthy. So maybe I'm being a bit too harsh on them. At least they've endured by not staining their clothing. And people think that this is probably a reference to some of the soiled garments that you might have, defiled garments, and maybe it's an allusion to the wool industry in Sardis. Could be, I don't know. I mean, maybe that's stretching it. But we do know that soiled garments, those with soiled garments were removed from public lists of citizens. In the pagan religions, it was forbidden to approach the gods in garments that were soiled or stained. I mean, we certainly in the Old Testament have, you can't offer a sacrifice that's blemished or soiled, right? And often that image of white is seen as purity or not being defiled. And so it's all of these different images. And remember, images are just so multifaceted, so they can mean a lot of different things. But whatever it means, I think the point is that they have not so accommodated to the prevailing culture. So they have not soiled themselves by defiling themselves by whether it's worshiping the pagan gods or participating in the pagan rites, worshiping the king and emperor, whatever it is, they haven't compromised. And that's a lot of what we talk about in these churches is compromising versus conquering. So that's repeated a lot. Now I'll pause right there for a minute. Does anybody want to ask me any questions? No. No, good. Okay. Well, just to review, because I think it helps me to go back and see some of these other churches and to think about all these connections. Remember, we talk about how the Christ visions, the beginning of the letter in the introduction, are often connected with these consequences that we see in the body of the letter. And oftentimes they're connected with the end too. But here, remember in Ephesus, we know that that church had issues with hospitality. We hear about it definitely in the Johannine letters. And then again here in Revelation, they had lost their first love. And I personally think that had more to do with loving one another because they were really good at picking out false teaching, so they weren't believing false things. It didn't sound like they were compromising their belief or their worship, but they were compromising how they loved and cared for one another. And so it's interesting that in that opening vision, you get the image of Jesus walking amongst them, right? So they are the ones who know that his presence is there because he is present among them, walking amongst the lampstands, which are the churches, right? And holding the 7 stars in his hand. So definitely an image of presence and being among them. And so in the consequences, they're told to return to their first love or they will lose their lampstand, their church, right? So in the second letter to Smyrna, we have these issues. What we know they're facing is persecution and death, right? They are no problem spiritually alive, but they're being persecuted by those around them. And so the consequences, so there we get that image again of Jesus as the one who is, the first and the last, the one who was dead and now is alive. And so we get that imagery. That's what's highlighted in the opening. And then the consequences, we're told, be faithful unto death, and you will be given the crown of life, right? So the crown that lasts forever. So lots of images surrounding life and death and what true life is. So this promise of life beyond death and the greater reward that is to come. And then in Pergamum, city that's dealing with compromise, that image, Jesus is depicted as the one with the double-edged sword coming out of his mouth, right? So this is somebody who's coming to judge, right? Because the person, the emperor or the ruler, the sword equaled authority and judgment. So they are told their consequences. If they do not repent, then Jesus is coming to make war on them with the sword of their mouth. So that was pretty harsh. And likewise, Thyatira that we saw last week was also pretty harsh, because they too, same sort of issue, compromise with the prevailing culture. And there Jesus was depicted. Remember, he had those fiery eyes and he had that feet of bronze or brass. Remember, he's like a superhero kind of guy. So again, it's this militaristic, I can see everything. I can judge you. I am mighty. He was coming. If they did not examine their own minds and hearts and shape up and repent, then their consequence was going to be what their actions deserved. That's what they were going to get. And then finally, today in Sardis, we're told that their issue is spiritual apathy. Like it seems like they were past the point of Pergamum and Thyatira. So it wasn't just, do we compromise or don't we? Some people are compromising, some are holding fast. Here it's just like a meh. They kind of already given up. Just they were the walking dead, the beautiful but dead corpse, living. As one person put it before, it's kind of like, I think it's a trope, but it's a trope for a reason. The guy who was the quarterback in high school, who all he does in midlife is just relive those football games because that was his glory days. So Sardis's glory days as the capital, long gone. They don't matter as much anymore. They are not the center of a great kingdom anymore. So like the city itself, the church there was dead, just spiritually dead. And so we get this image of Jesus. Sorry, I couldn't find a better one. I might work on it some, but I thought this was the best I could get with the seven spirits kind of surrounding him, the color and the movement of the image. Maybe it recalls some kind of movement and life and spirit, and him, of course, holding the seven stars in that image. So the one who is alive is surrounded by the full Spirit of God, is the one who is coming and telling them to wake up, to escape from the brink of death that they're tottering on, because he's about to come like a thief. Remember, surprise attack that the city is known for. So they need to wake up. Don't be completely overtaken. Don't absolutely die, because there's only a few of you that still haven't sold your clothes. So that's what they're told. And then when we get to the very end with this conclusion, the conquering promise and the call to hear, remember that's the formula, but here in the first three letters, we got the call to hear and then the conquering promise. And in the last four, we get the conquering promise and the call to hear. So it is flipped. So here, what we're told is those who emerge victorious will wear white clothing like this. I won't scratch out their names from the scroll of life or book of life, but will declare their names in the presence of my Father and his angels. And then the call to hear, the concluding exhortation, if you prefer. If you can hear, listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. So here, the conquering promise, let's break it down a bit. Three promises. One, you'll get to wear white clothes. So here, the victory, the conquering promise, is this reference to white clothing. And I do like Jennifer Hunter-Jones' modern paintings. You can see the saints wearing their white clothes up here. So like the faithful Sardinian Christians who were just referenced in that promise, they too, if they repent, if they wake up, if they escape that brink of tottering death, they too will be granted to wear white clothes. So they too will be the ones who have overcome the stains of the society. So they will be considered pure and they will have this white clothing, right? So it's not too late. You can come back from that brink. You don't have to wear the soiled clothes, right? You don't have to participate in the pagan culture. come back. And then the book of life, I thought I'd just let Alan Johnson explain this one. He says, for Christ to say that he will never erase the overcomer's name from the book of life is the strongest affirmation that death can never separate us from Christ and his life. A person enrolled in the book of life by faith remains in it by faithfulness and can be erased only by disloyalty. There is some evidence that a person's name could be removed from the city register before death if he were convicted of a crime. In the first century, Christians who were loyal to Christ were under constant threat of being branded political and social rebels and then stripped of their citizenship. But Christ offers them eternally safe citizenship in his everlasting kingdom, if only they will remain loyal to him. So again, in these ancient cities, the names of citizens were recorded in a register, and they're there until death. And then upon death, their names are erased or marked out from the book of the living, right? But even before death, as Alan Johnson is saying, your name could be erased. Your citizenship could be lost. So, just kind of like Jesus says back in the Sermon on the Mount, he tells us, not to place our wealth in things that can rust, where thieves can break in and they can steal and destroy. Same sort of idea. Like, don't put your faith in a citizenship that can be removed and be lost. Put your faith in a citizenship that is eternal. That's the same sort of idea, that book of life where it can never be erased. On a side note, we drove down here with my in-laws, and I was giving them a tour around Florence in my hometown, and all of a sudden, I'm not even sure where it came from. We just passed my home church, but we started talking about Calvinism and Reformed theology, and she had all these questions about tulip. She was like, somebody was telling me something about tulip. I'm like, oh yeah, tulip. Let me tell you what that stands for. And so we were talking about the Synods of Dort and what tulip stands for, and I got to that unconditional election part. And it's that idea, of course, that the saints that are chosen and drawn to God are unconditionally elected, and they are going to persevere, that perseverance of the saints. So it's interesting here because, Revelation definitely seems to warn that if you are disloyal, if you don't persevere, actually you can be disowned. But if you do persevere, you will never be disowned, right? In fact, that's kind of the final promise. I'll tell you about this in a second. I'll come back to it. That final promise is almost, the language is legal almost. It almost sounds like, I'm going to acknowledge you. I'm going to swear and recognize you in front of this kind of legal court, this heavenly court before God and the angels. Like, I'm going to acknowledge you. I'm going to recognize you. So it's this great promise of that. But Revelation definitely does have this image of, you need to be loyal. You need to be on the right side. Don't be lost almost. Anyway, we could get into a whole theological debate about that. And clearly people have been doing it for 2,000 years. But I thought instead I would leave you with this final story. You remember I told you about Croesus and about Cyrus? Well, I'm also going to introduce this other guy named Solon. You may know this story already. But after Cyrus takes the citadel of Sardis and Croesus is brought out, they decide they're going to kill the king, right? So he is put on a funeral pyre. That's what you see here. And you got this servant who is lighting the fire. So he's about to be burned to death. And so while he is on the pyre being burned, he cries out, "Oh, Solon, Solon." And Cyrus, watching him being burned, is curious. And he's like, what is that? What did he just say? And he's like, "Oh, Solon, Solon." He repeats the name. And Cyrus is like, "Who is this? Tell me more about this Solon. Like, why are you, why are you saying this name?" And Cyrus has translators. And so they translate for him. And they translate that Croesus just said, "He is someone I would give a fortune to have every ruler in the world to meet." And so, of course, Cyrus is even more intrigued. Well, why? And so apparently Solon, being this very wise man, this prophet, when Croesus is kind of like bragging about all its wealth that he has, he's like, you can't tell if you were wealthy or favored by the gods until you know the end of your life and the end of your story. Like, you can only count a man fortunate in hindsight when you know what has happened. You can only count his life meaningful when you see his death, basically, at the end of it. And so basically, Croesus, in reflecting on his life, is saying, it was all meaningless. My wealth was meaningless. How I'd spent my life was meaningless. And so what I think the message here to the church in Sardis is basically live a life that is meaningful, that is undefiled, that gets you an eternal citizenship, not one that can be lost, and that gets you recognition in front of God and God's heavenly court. Go for things that are eternal, not great wealth that can be lost, not accommodating to a society that can turn its back on you. I think that's the message that he's saying. And I think in many ways, that's probably one that Croesus would endorse too. So that's the end of this story. Do you guys have any questions about this letter or anything you'd like to ask? Susanna?
Now, if John, or I'm just going to assume, because I want to, that John is on exile in Patmos and writes these 7 letters, where would he be getting he seems to have a lot of information about these 7 churches.
Right.
Where do we think he would have gotten all this information that he has? Would people be visiting him, or?
It's, it's certainly possible that people would have been visiting. I think he would have already known a lot about these communities just from having lived in Ephesus prior to exile. So, they may have already had reputations for certain things. And so maybe he already knew a good bit about them. It's possible that, remember I've mentioned Prochorus a bit. So he's his disciple who is also his amanuensis and writes for him. It's possible that maybe he is not technically exiled and could come and go. Maybe other people could come and go. I don't know. We know so very little about how Patmos was used in antiquity. I think it's only got like maybe 3 references in antiquity to the island itself. We do know that there were penal colonies and that people were exiled. It's likely that that island could have been used in that way, but there's just so little we know about who was allowed on it, who wasn't, could people come and go? It wouldn't surprise me if people were coming and going. Why would you have like a whole garrison of soldiers or something just to guard people who are in exile? I just imagine that there probably was a lot more coming and going than we imagine. So maybe that's where it came from. Yeah. Or, not to discount the idea of just divine knowledge, so if he can receive apocalyptic visions, certainly, he could receive divine knowledge about what's going on. So not to discount that either. So
great, thank you.
Yes, Susanna, when you asked that question, I was thinking of when Miguel de Unamuno was exiled. He was the rector of the University of Salamanca and had his differences with Franco, the dictator.
Oh, yeah.
And so he was exiled in the Canary Islands. And he got a lot of information while he was there. And some of it came through fishermen. So I'm sure there were other methods too.
Yeah, and that's a good point. It's not far off the coast of Turkey. It is not hard to get to. So yeah, clearly people were probably coming and going. Great. Any other questions?
I don't have any questions, but I have to tell you that it's fascinating, and I love the way you are enthusiastic and you can just keep talking and talking and bring up one subject after another and one name after another, and it just keeps the interest going, and I'm appreciative of the time that you're doing this. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. That's kind of you. I think it's probably a little overwhelming, but
it is.
Yeah, when you have like 1 hour to do it, ultimately what I would love to do is to break these down into like little mini 5 or 10 minute lessons, and to have like a 10-week study that people could do on their own and maybe in small groups, but you could watch like a 5 or 10 minute lesson. And so you learn like one little thing that day. I think that's a bit easier and bit less knowledge overload. But when you have 1 hour, you just do it all at once. So.
Well, the format of the letters, I think, is fascinating.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree. It could easily be broken down into bits, digestible, not overwhelming bits. So. Yeah, and I don't know if Pastor, do you go by Father Gregory, Father Greg, Pastor Gregory?
You can just call me Greg.
I can just call you Greg. Okay, awesome. That's great. Yeah, so one really interesting idea with this 7 letters that I would love to see somebody do, and I've heard of other groups doing, is 7 churches getting together, and the pastors each took one of the different letters and they rotated between their congregations. So kind of a rotating sort of thing. And each one preached on the different letter. And so for like 7 weeks, it was kind of like a pastor share, which was obviously great for the priests and pastors because they just had to prepare one and they gave it 7 times, but also just the interconnection between the congregations. And just everybody in those 7 churches were doing the study at the same time. So I'd love to see somebody do something like that. Just an idea.
You're bringing in all this knowledge of antiquity and numismatics and things like that, and I think it would be kind of hard to preach the same sermon 7 times on a couple of verses in the beginning of Revelation. I think that would be heavy sledding. That would be so other parts of the New Testament are a lot easier to preach on than the historical intricacies that you're bringing out in this. I have to say it's also a better reflection on Revelation than many times that gets all worked up in the prophecy, which gets, boy, you can interpret dreams any way you like. I mean, all kinds of crazy stuff, and I don't know how useful that is to my life as I'm trying to live faithfully, but this is more like this is people trying to live their lives in a context, and that makes it's more, I can relate to it in a way. I can understand what it's. I don't have a temple to Artemis I have to worry about, but
No.
I have other things I have to worry about, which are also concrete. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we all have the temptation to spiritual apathy. We can relate to that.
The
we
temple
can
of Netflix, maybe.
Yeah. But you're right. I mean, this morning, like I said, my parents are listening in the other room, but they had television on, like waiting for like one church service between another. And in between those church services, there was a pastor on who was doing prophecy. Like he was doing a sermon on prophecy, but it was the kind that basically was talking about how all the prophecies are coming true and how globalization is, the end of society as a whole. And just, talking about the prophecies in Daniel and some of Revelation and how it's all happening like right now. And so we were kind of just talking about that afterwards. And I said, I don't really have much time for that kind of interpretation of prophecy because people have been doing it for thousands of years and saying, look, it's happening right now. I mean, you think about the bubonic plague. This is the end. This is Revelation's happening right now. You think about the Reformation, the Pope is the Antichrist. This is it. This is the sign. Every single generation, I feel like, has been saying this is it. And so
in
I never have
2004, the Red Sox won the World Series.
Either.
So there you go.
There you go. Exactly. But the one thing that I did take away from his sermon, because I listened to it for a little bit and how he was interpreting things, is that he said, as Christians, we can do one of 2 things. We can either worry about what's happening and just become extremely worryful, or we can worship. And I thought, well, that actually is a really good summary of Revelation, which is full of worship. We're not talking about that much, but outside of the letters, full of worship. So either you can worry about what's happening, or you can take these messages, which I think in many ways are not just a wake up, but they are a don't worry to the faithful, like somebody else is in charge. Even beyond death, there is life. These are messages of hope and messages and calls to worship. So you can worry or you can worship. And I thought that was a really good word that he had.
All right, I'll take it. It's good.
Yeah. anything else? I don't know if I have anybody to pass it back over to or not, or if I just say that we're going to end it here. So thank you for showing up. And we just have
Thank you.
2 more weeks left. Next week, we're traveling to Philadelphia. You think you've been there before, but we're going to the original Philadelphia. And then we have a break the next week because I think there is like an annual something going on. I forget what they told me it was, but then the following week we'll be back and finish off with Laodicea. So that's it.
All right.
Well, thank you.
Thanks.
Have a good Sunday.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hmm.